I'm Alvaro Castillo with the UCLA College, and this is Feathers and Flirtations, a spotlight on an exuberant tropical bird. The clicks and whistles you just heard belong to a tropical bird that lives in the moist, lowland forest of Panama, the golden-collared manakin. For over 2 decades, Barney A. Schlinger, a UCLA professor of integrative biology and physiology, has dedicated his research to this small but sonorous bird species. In his recent book, The Wingsnappers, Lessons from an Exuberant Tropical Bird, Schlinger presents an exploration of the golden-collared manakin's anatomy, behavior, and underlying biological mechanisms. Apparently, it takes a lot to impress a lady golden-collared manakin. Males perform one of the most acrobatic, physically complex, and noisy courtship displays of any animal on the planet. I had the opportunity to sit down with Professor Schlinger and learn more about the bird he's dedicated his career to. Professor Schlinger, what makes the golden-collared manakin's courtship dance so unique?
Well, it's an extraordinary combination of physically intensive behaviors that include a tremendous amount of auditory stimulation. So there's this tremendous combination of both visual and acoustic information that the bird is sending out into the environment. The male's courtship dance or display is done with exceptional speed. So each movement is incredibly quick, and they just perform each of these acrobatic elements with exceptional accuracy and grace. You put this all together, and it's quite a phenomenal experience when you see it in nature, because there you are in the middle of a beautiful, lush rainforest with monkeys and parrots and snakes and lizards and the flowers and such. And there in the middle of it, this bird is doing this extraordinary courtship display. Moreover, the males gather in these groups called leks, and there can be many of these males in a patch of forest. So this whole little area of the forest just explodes in sound. It's quite fascinating, quite unique.
I hear that one of the acrobatics that they do is cartwheels as well. Have you witnessed that?
Well, what they do, one of their displays is they will do a jump to the ground from a perch where they do a flip with a half twist and then land and springboard straight up onto another branch. There's that flip element and twist in the middle of it, which, as I mentioned in my book, I was a gymnast, and of course, every little kid almost is a gymnast of some sort. So all these ideas of doing flips and twists that seem to have no other purpose in life other than to just be cool motoric displays, we all do them, and the manakin has included it in its courtship display, so presumably females like it.
Tell us the story. What was it like for you to see this courtship behavior in person for the first time?
Well, I had heard about these manakins in the tropics and doing these phenomenal behaviors, and but of course, even seeing a video of it just doesn't do it justice. If you're in the forest, as I was describing, before, where you're in this lush, wonderful environment, and there in the middle of the forest, the bird has cleared out this little patch, this clearing that, again, I still find quite phenomenal, that in the middle of a rainforest with leaves falling and huge amounts of rain and everything, that these little males can keep a patch of forest completely clear. So it's just a patch of dirt in the middle of otherwise the forest filled with leaves and twigs and such. So you see that and you go, wow, that little tiny 18-gram bird is keeping this forest clear. That's a rather phenomenal piece of the whole story. But then he is rapidly jumping around and doing flips and making these exceptionally loud wing snapping sounds that we didn't know how they were made when I first saw them. And it's so loud. hopefully people will be able to listen and hear the snapping and or watch it on a video and realize that it's the wings that are making those sounds. And they're just exceptionally loud for this tiny bird. And then when you hear it emanating, as I mentioned earlier, from a whole group of males, where the whole little patch of forest explodes in this snapping sounds, it's impressive and captures your attention.
To what degree did it inspire the title of your book?
Well, it's the real key to these birds. They throw their wings over their back and strike to their wrist bones together and make this, it's a loud snap, and it's this relatively small bird. It's impressive. It draws your attention. You hear it, you see it, and you kind of, your eyes, you tilt your head and you say, how can they make such a loud sound?
You mentioned that they weigh 18 grams. Over time, has that stayed consistent, or have you seen a change in the weight of manakins?
No, I mean, we've not studied them long enough to see that. I know that there's some evidence that's been presented actually by another investigator here at UCLA, Morgan Tingley, that bird weights have changed probably in response to anthropogenically related climate change. But I doubt it's happened in these birds.
Why are these birds so special to you, and how did they inspire you to write your book?
Well, they really captured my attention largely because my background and interest was in the physiology of behavior, how hormones act upon the brain to motivate animals to perform and then to actually produce the ultimate behaviors they produce. And people had studied songbirds as an example of how birds can both learn, some songbirds, the babies learn their song from their father, and then they babble like baby humans and copy their father's song, and then seasonally they sing or they don't sing. And there are huge changes that take place in the brain. So there's this tremendous neuroplasticity and this connection between the auditory system, the sensory system, and the motor output. So it's all very, very complex. And that's just to control singing, which is a few little tiny muscles in the throat. Well, here's the manakin who is doing a similar kind of display to attract females or have little territories, but they're using essentially every muscle in their body to produce these very, very complex acoustic and visual displays. So I was immediately captured by the idea that there's a lot going on in the central nervous system of these birds that we know nothing about. And I was stimulated to try to begin to think about how we could figure that out.
Physically, what would you say is most striking about the golden-collared manakin?
Well, one of the things that we started working on in my lab and has now been carried on by one of my postdocs named Matt Fuchsjäger is that there are just extraordinary muscles that are modified to produce these sounds. And so the hormone testosterone acts on androgen receptors in certain muscles to allow them to contract at exceptionally fast rates. And they're hypertrophied relative to muscles in other birds. And there's also some skeletal adaptations as well. So the birds are investing a lot of their biology into making sounds and modifying their bones and their muscles. But underneath it all, the central nervous system is, you can just imagine that there's this exceptionally rapid processing. They're hearing things, it's being transferred into a motor output, and so all the neurons that are involved to control those muscles are just doing so sort of impeccably and rapidly.
What makes you proudest of the book and of your years studying this bird?
That's a hard question. I think developing a research program that involves being in the field in rainforest where it rains a lot and the weather conditions can change very quickly, in a small country where some of the infrastructure is minimal, and including that with laboratory research here at UCLA. So that was all rather challenging. More people are doing that these days, so it's improved a great deal. But I think another thing that I'm proud of is I've worked with some really remarkable people. You bring postdocs or graduate students into your lab, or even undergraduates, and you go into the field, and everybody is trying to figure out how things work, and ultimately experiments are done. We learn things, and then these people go off and they're become prominent scientists in their own right. And so being a piece of that whole process is really fulfilling. And I've stayed friendly with my previous postdocs. We still communicate, and we continue to share fun stories about mannequins.
I hear your mother had some thoughts about the editorial process. Could you tell us that story and what she thought about the finished book?
So this was my first book, and I had no idea how long it would take to go from, submitting a proposal to having it ultimately published, and it took some time. And at one point, I was told by my editor that it would be about a year before the hard copy would be available. Well, my mother at the time was 94 years old, and she said to me, she said, "You tell that editor that I'm going to die before that book's out and for them to move more quickly." Well, I told that story to the editor, and she said, "I have a mother like that." So it turns out the book came out three or 4 months before my mom actually did pass. So she saw it. I got to give it to her. I got to write a nice little special note that she was able to see, and I know she was very proud to know that I had written a book.
What a gift.
Yeah, it was perfect.
Did she have any last minute criticisms even after it was published?
Oh, I'm sure wherever she is now, she's still finding something to criticize, but no, it's all good.
There's a lot of positive feedback on the back cover of your book. Can you talk about any of the authors that had something good to say?
Oh yeah. In fact, one of them who wrote a very nice blurb. His name is Bernd Heinrich, and interestingly enough, he has a connection to UCLA. He got his PhD, I believe, here at UCLA, studying ravens, and he has authored many books on birds and nature. I believe he's now fully retired, but he lives in the woods in Maine, and he's a fantastically interesting person. But I was very proud that he was one of the reviewers who liked my book.
What kind of research did he engage in?
Well, he studied, was kind of early on studying the intelligence of ravens, which has now become very popular. Like I say, his books about nature, he lives in the forest, and he knows a great deal about the intricacies of not just birds, but other organisms and their lives. And I remember in one of his books, there's a whole story about these small birds called golden-crowned kinglets, which are just tiny little, beautiful little birds, but they live in the coniferous forests in Maine, and where it's just brutally cold and windy and nasty in the wintertime, and yet these little birds that probably weigh 10 grams are thriving, and he goes into great depth about that in one of his books, and you just, at the end of the passages, you just really admire golden-crowned kinglets.
How often or how common would you say it is for small, beautiful little birds to live in very harsh conditions?
Oh, they do all over the planet. Many animals do, but it's impressive to me, especially how small birds. You think about a kinglet, a little tiny kinglet living in a where it's 30 below zero, and they're out feeding, and it's like you wonder why their eyeballs don't freeze instantly when they open their eyes. But of course they do just fine, and they spend their nights in holes in trees where they can huddle together with others and keep warm, but they're thriving in really intense environments.
What would you say is the most resilient bird species native to Southern California or even Los Angeles?
It's a hard question because, at some level, all birds are resilient. They're all thriving. Some of them are migrating long distances. Some of them are out in the middle of the 120-degree heat in the desert. They all have their own physiological and behavioral capacities to just simply thrive. And, if it gets a little chilly outside, or it rains, or it hails, or there's a huge windstorm, and we run inside and huddle up, and they're out there just waiting it out. And as soon as it's over, they're back in business.
How have advances in technology allowed you to better understand the acrobatics of the golden-collared manakin?
At the outset, one of the things we realized is that the behavior of the birds is occurring at such great speed that we couldn't really discern what the birds were doing. And we needed to try to utilize high-speed videography, which at the time was in a fairly primitive state. There were high-speed video or photographic equipment, but it was large, heavy, noisy, and so it wasn't until about 20 or so years ago that people developed what is now commonly used to be able to capture high-speed video. And so we did that, and were able to take it into the forest and record the behavior of these birds. And it was at that point that we suddenly appreciated just how beautiful the courtship display is, how absolutely perfect the male's movements are, the elegance of their movements in midair, but what that all points to is, and what we have subsequently learned, is that our visual processing systems are relatively slow, but the female manakin is seeing the male, and so her visual processing speed is much faster than ours. So she's capturing all of that elegance that we need specialized equipment to discern. So she has a bit of an advantage over us.
Are there any birds in the bird kingdom that you would say are either equally or even more elegant flyers than the golden-collared manakin?
Well, when you talk about flying, the courtship display actually is largely jumping and by the males and not flying. Certainly they're spectacular. Flight is an extraordinary adaptation of a huge number of bird species. But there are some 50-odd species of manakins all throughout the neotropics, and many of them have very elaborate social systems or courtship displays. The birds of paradise that live in New Guinea and northern Australia and some other islands, they're extraordinary. Also, they all these birds in the tropics, if there's plenty of food around, then the females are liberated to take care of the babies all by themselves, the hatchlings, and the males can then spend their time just courting. And so it's evolved in the tropics of both Southeast Asia and also in the neotropics.
Ultimately, what is the lesson we should learn from this exuberant tropical bird?
Well, I think there's a number of lessons. One lesson is that, when you see a video of rainforest being plowed down to the ground, you have to appreciate that within that patch of rainforest, there are extraordinary creatures that are being destroyed. Every day, manakins throughout South and Central America, their homes are being destroyed, and they have nowhere else to go. And so I hope that by people realizing that the rainforest is a great deal more than just trees. It's the homes of these extraordinary animals. That's one lesson. Another lesson is that animals do extraordinary things. Organisms do extraordinary things. We know very little about many of them. We're all excited about things that human beings do and sending rockets to Mars and stuff. But you know what? Just taking a hike through a rainforest and seeing all the different animals and what they're doing and studying that and learning how how they do that, that's also a kind of expedition that is of critical importance. And many of the findings have application to us. I mean, the way that we study how hormones can influence the central nervous system or muscles. We too have hormones that act on our brains and muscles, and it's hard to study us. So we often have to think about how those actions are happening in us based on the metaphor of what we've learned in these animals. And so I think there's all of those are ways in which we need to really think about the study of animals is important, and we need to preserve their habitats.
Is there anything else you want to share with us today?
No, I'm just thank you for inviting me, and again, just pointing out how much teamwork is involved in doing these kinds of studies, and all the colleagues and collaborators I've had, and I've had a great home here at UCLA that has enabled me to carry on these studies, and so I owe thanks. My very first time I went to tropics, I got some small, $2,000 faculty Senate grant, and that kickstarted a 25-year, project. So I owe thanks to UCLA as well.
And the project continues.
It continues, absolutely.
This is Alvaro Castillo with Feathers and Flirtations, which was produced by Trevor Ducote for the UCLA College. Special thanks to Professor Barney Schlinger, whose book, The Wingsnappers, is now available.